He threw the crutch across the room. It hit the wall, cracked, and fell beside the dog who wouldn't move. "Leave me," the man said, but the dog didn't. He just stared back, bleeding paws pressed against the door, waiting. He was a decorated veteran. 2 years earlier, he had been carried home from a desert blast. The explosion took his legs, his brothers in arms, and something worse, his will to live. He stopped talking, stopped fighting. The wheelchair became part of him, the silence his only companion. And then came Max, a German shepherd no one wanted. The files said, "Failed K9, too gentle, too soft, unfit for service." But the dog refused to leave his side, even when Raymond screamed, even when he fell. Every night, the soldier shook with nightmares. Every night, the dog pressed close like a heartbeat that refused to die. No one understood what they saw next. The same man who had stopped believing began to feel again. But no miracle comes without pain. And one stormy night, when everything should have been lost, that failed dog did what soldiers are trained to do. He stayed. Before we begin, take a breath. And if you believe loyalty can still save a life, hit subscribe to Healing with Max, share this story, and tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I believe this story deserves to go further and further. The storm that morning had passed like a breath held too long, leaving the Colorado woods glazed in silver and silence. The sky, pale and wide as a forgotten canvas, hung low over the mountains, where pines bowed beneath the weight of snow. Smoke rose thinly from a chimney that hadn't known laughter in years. The cabin below it seemed smaller than the world deserved, a wooden shell pressed into the earth, where sound went to die. Inside, the only movement was the flicker of light against dust, and the faint hum of a medical machine keeping rhythm with a life too quiet to notice. Raymond Cole sat by the window, where the glass had long been blurred by frost. 55 years old, but he looked older, his hair already a dull steel gray, his face carved by the wind of places no man should have to remember. His shoulders were still broad, though the body beneath them had grown hollow, shrunken by stillness. The wheelchair had become an extension of him, its metal frame reflecting the dull amber glow of a dying day. He did not blink often. His eyes were fixed on something far beyond the tree line, something the world couldn't see. Perhaps the desert where it all ended. The explosion had been merciless, and though the doctors said he was lucky to live, Raymond knew better. Survival was not the same as life. The blast had taken both his legs and everything that had made them worth standing on. His purpose, his brothers in arms, his pride. The quiet was louder now than the gunfire had ever been. His father, Hank Cole, stood in the doorway behind him, a broad-shouldered man in his 70s whose frame had bent under years of ranch work, but never under defeat. His beard was white, his eyes still fierce beneath thick brows. He had been through wars of his own, just different kinds. In his weathered hands hung an old leash, cracked and stiff from disuse. The sound of its buckle clinking broke the still air. "I brought you something," Hank said, his voice low, gravelly, the tone of a man who had run out of easy words years ago. Raymond didn't answer. He rarely did. The hum of the oxygen machine swallowed his silence whole. Through the open door came a rush of cold air, and behind it, a shape, a German shepherd, tall, proud, yet strangely hesitant. The dog's coat was a mix of sable and ash, flecked with pale silver near the muzzle, and his eyes carried the kind of sadness one only earns through loyalty. His gait was steady, but there was a wariness in it, as if he, too, knew what it meant to be unwanted. "This here's Max," Hank said, tugging gently at the leash. "Was in the K-9 program down in Fort Collins. Didn't pass. They said he wasn't aggressive enough." Still no reaction. Raymond's stare didn't shift. Hank exhaled, a sound heavy with both pity and patience. "He's yours if you want him. If not, he'll stay anyway." He unhooked the leash and stepped back. The old floorboards creaked under his boots, then under the soft pads of the dog's feet as Max crossed the room. Raymond's reflection ghosted across the window. One man in shadow, one creature in motion, both caught between memory and meaning. Max stopped beside the wheelchair. He didn't bark. He didn't beg. He simply looked up at the man before him, the way dogs do when they see what others have missed, a soul half buried but still breathing. Then, with a quiet sigh, he lowered himself to the floor, head resting across his paws, close enough that his breath fogged the cold metal rim of the chair. For the first time in weeks, the sound of Raymond's breathing changed. It slowed, deepened. His hand twitched slightly, but he didn't notice. He just kept staring out at the forest, where wind stirred the branches like ghosts brushing against the glass. The evening fell early that night, draping the cabin in soft blue darkness. Hank sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read the newspaper but really listening, to the silence, to the steady pulse of machine and man and dog. There was something different in it, something small but living. The old man didn't say a word. He only folded the paper, set it aside, and watched as the snow began again outside the window. By midnight, Raymond was asleep in his chair, chin slumped toward his chest. The fireplace had burned down to embers, throwing faint light over Max's coat. The dog's eyes stayed open, unblinking, watching the veteran with the same stillness a soldier keeps when guarding a fallen comrade. Every few minutes he lifted his head, sniffed the air, then lowered it again, satisfied. His breathing matched Raymond's, slow, heavy, fragile. Somewhere near dawn, a faint light seeped through the curtains, brushing against Raymond's face. His eyes fluttered open, disoriented. The hum of the machine still filled the air. But something felt different. The air was warmer somehow, closer. He glanced down. Max was there, pressed close to the chair, his head resting gently against Raymond's leg, against the place where feeling had long ago disappeared. The dog's eyes were closed, his body still. Yet his weight carried meaning, quiet and deliberate. Raymond blinked once, twice, unsure if he imagined it. But no, he felt it. A pressure, faint but undeniable, spreading through the skin like a whisper from beneath the earth. His chest tightened. The sound of the machine faded into the background, replaced by the rhythm of his own heart, beating harder than it had in months. He reached out, slowly, his hand trembling as it brushed over the fur at Max's neck. The warmth there was startling. Real. Outside, the first wind of morning swept through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and melting frost. The sun broke the horizon, spilling light through the window in thin, trembling lines. For a moment, everything was suspended. The man, the dog, the world itself, as if creation had paused to witness a spark where none was supposed to exist. No words were spoken. None were needed. The silence inside the cabin was no longer empty. It was full of breath, of warmth, of something quietly awakening. And though Raymond didn't know it yet, that morning marked the first time in years that he didn't dream of dying. The morning light came slow and uncertain, creeping across the frost-bitten windows like a memory that no longer knew how to shine. Outside, the snow hadn't stopped. It had simply grown tired of falling loud. The pines bowed under its weight, their dark arms heavy with silence. Smoke curled from the cabin's chimney, thin and ghost-colored, swaying in the pale blue of dawn like a fragile heartbeat that wasn't sure it belonged to the living. Inside, the air held that peculiar stillness of places where grief had learned to breathe quietly. Max lay near the hearth, one ear twitching at every groan of timber. His coat shimmered faintly in the half-light, gray and brown with streaks of gold like dust from old metals. Raymond watched him from the chair, jaw set, eyes flat as the winter horizon. He didn't understand the dog's calm, how it could simply exist without asking anything in return. The machine beside him hummed its slow reassurance, the only sound that proved time hadn't stopped altogether. Days drifted like fog through the valley. The calendar on the wall never changed. Neither did the pattern of Raymond's silence. Max fetched nothing, barked at no one. He seemed to know his presence was already too much, so he moved with the kind of gentleness that makes even air feel heavy. But when Raymond tried to push him away, the dog always returned, silent, stubborn, loyal. Once, irritated, Raymond had opened the door wide to the storm outside and ordered him out with a sharp motion. Max hesitated, then stepped into the cold without a sound. Hours later, when Raymond finally looked back, the dog was there again, soaked and shivering by the doorstep, his eyes fixed on the man who had banished him. Raymond didn't speak, but he left the door open this time, and Max crossed the threshold as if he'd never left at all. At dusk, the fire painted amber bars across the wooden floor, striping their shadows together, wheelchair and paws, man and dog. Hank moved quietly around them, repairing a broken hinge, checking the stove, pretending not to notice the fragile rhythm that had taken root. He watched Raymond's hands, the way they no longer trembled when Max lay near, the way his son's face softened, if only for moments, as though the silence between them was beginning to hum with something like trust. But in Hank's eyes, there was more than hope. There was fear, too, the kind that comes from believing again after you've already buried belief once before. He remembered the day they wheeled Raymond off that transport plane, the smell of antiseptic and oil, the stillness of a body that had seen too much. He had told himself then that faith was just another word for denial. Yet now, watching that strange animal curl beside his son, he felt faith stirring again, fragile as frost on glass. "Don't break him," he murmured inwardly, not to the dog, but to God. The nights were a different country. When the wind rose and the walls moaned, the ghosts returned. The desert came roaring back, the metallic taste of dust, the blinding flash that tore sound apart, the smell of burnt rubber and blood. Raymond's mind replayed it without mercy. The radio screaming, then silence, then the shockwave that ended everything he used to be. His breath hitched, his muscles locked, and the world folded into sand and fire. That was when Max moved. Without command, without hesitation, he climbed onto the rug beside the wheelchair and pressed his body against the man's chest. His weight was solid, grounding, as if to pin Raymond to the present. The dog's breath came slow and deep, and in that rhythm, something inside the veteran began to unclench. The tremors softened. The room grew smaller, safer. For the first time in 2 years, the soldier's nightmares met something stronger than fear, steadfast warmth. Hank would sometimes wake to that sight, his son asleep for real, not in exhaustion, but in surrender. The German shepherd watching over him with eyes that never blinked. The old man would stand there in the doorway, the lamplight catching the moisture in his eyes, and whisper, "Maybe angels wear fur when heaven runs out of wings." Then he'd turn away, not trusting his own hope. By the third night, the rhythm became a ritual. Each time the screams began, Max was there, pressing close until the storm passed. Each dawn, Raymond awoke drenched in sweat but less hollow, aware of small things again. The way snow tapped the window, the scent of pine sap on the stove logs, the soft click of claws across the floor. Even the sound of his own breathing began to feel like something worth keeping. Then came the morning that bent the course of everything. Hank arrived early, his boots heavy with frost, and felt the air shift before he even reached the door. Inside, the chair was overturned, one wheel spinning slow, creaking like an old clock trying to measure a new kind of time. Raymond lay on the floor, eyes wide, body trembling. Max stood over him, shoulders squared, fur bristled, lips drawn back just enough to show the line of his teeth. A low growl rolled from deep in his chest, not of threat, but of warning. Hank froze at the threshold. For a terrible instant he thought he'd stumbled into loss again, that the dog had turned, that grief had found another form. But then he saw Raymond's face, alive with confusion, his hands gripping the floorboards, the tremor running through his arms like a current finding its circuit. Hank's voice cracked the silence. "Son?" Max didn't move. His body formed a wall between the two men, eyes fixed on the door as if guarding something sacred. Only when Hank stepped back did the dog relax, panting, tail low, gaze flicking once toward Raymond before lowering his head beside him. The old man's knees buckled. He reached for the table to steady himself, every part of him shaking. It wasn't fear now. It was recognition. Life was returning to a place long dead. Raymond's breathing came in bursts. He tried to speak but only managed a gasp. Then he felt it, deep, sharp, electric, a flicker in his left leg, faint as a pulse beneath ice. Pain. Real pain. He hadn't felt pain there since the explosion. The shock of it stole his breath, and for a second he thought he was dreaming again. But Max leaned in, nose against the scarred skin, pressing softly once, then again. The muscle twitched. Raymond stared, not daring to blink. He could feel the warmth through the dull ache, could sense the faint trembling of his own flesh waking beneath years of silence. It was unbearable, terrifying, glorious. Tears came uninvited, the kind that burn rather than soothe. He looked at the dog, and Max looked back, eyes deep and steady, holding him to this new truth. Outside, the world was changing color. The sun reached over the ridge, spilling gold over the snow and painting the cabin windows in firelight. Steam rose from the roof like breath from something newly alive. Inside, the air was heavy with disbelief and wonder. Raymond's voice finally broke, rough and small. "Max." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The dog's ears twitched at the sound, tail giving a slow, deliberate flick. He pressed once more against the leg, the movement precise, patient, and when Raymond flinched, not from fear, but from feeling. Max exhaled through his nose, a quiet, satisfied sound, as if confirming what he already knew. The old man stood in the corner, hand to his chest, whispering something too soft to catch. Maybe it was a prayer. Maybe it was gratitude. The room held it all the same. And in that hush, between heartbeat and breath, the soldier stared down at his own limb in disbelief while the dog nudged it once more, one final, gentle insistence, and the muscle twitched again beneath scarred skin. The road into town was still slick with thawing snow, but Hank drove slow, both hands tight on the wheel. The old truck rattled with every mile, its heater coughing weakly against the morning cold. Raymond sat in the passenger seat, eyes fixed on the horizon that refused to move. Beside his left boot, Max kept his head low, his ears twitching with every turn, not from fear, but from vigilance. None of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty now, just heavy, like a prayer they were afraid to say aloud. The VA clinic rose out of the fog, a square of sterile white against the muted gray of winter. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and metal, too clean to feel alive. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Their brightness seemed cruel after the dim gentleness of the cabin. Behind the reception desk, the young nurse smiled with professional distance, eyes flicking from Raymond's wheelchair to the German shepherd that trailed behind. She hesitated, but Hank's hand on her counter was firm. "Dr. Hayes," he said, "we've got an appointment." Dr. Samuel Hayes was a man of 50, tall and spare, with steel-gray hair cropped close and a face cut by habit more than age. He wore the kind of white coat that made him seem untouched by weather, untouched by doubt. When he looked at Raymond, his gaze was polite but skeptical, the way a man might regard a ghost who'd shown up asking for proof of life. "You say you've regained sensation?" he asked, voice even, almost bored. Hank nodded. He felt something. We saw it happen. Dr. Hayes adjusted his glasses, the faintest twitch of a smile breaking the professional mask. "Nerve death is permanent, Mr. Cole. Once a connection's gone, it doesn't return." Raymond said nothing. He only looked at Max, who stood near the examination table, tail still, eyes calm, waiting. Hayes motioned for Raymond to transfer from the chair, his gestures brisk but not unkind. "Let's verify." Electrodes were placed, wires humming faintly. The monitor beside the table showed the flat, steady line of absence. No signal, no spark. Then Max moved. Without command, without hesitation, the shepherd jumped lightly onto the platform, the metal creaking under his weight. He pressed his paw, large, scarred, and steady, against Raymond's left leg. The monitor flickered. A pulse. A weak, irregular tremor of light along the line. But it was there. For a moment, no one breathed. Hank's voice broke first, a raw exhale that was half sob, half laughter. "You see that?" His hand gripped the table edge as if the world might tilt. Dr. Hayes frowned, leaning closer to the screen. "That's..." He stopped himself, checked the leads, then the machine. Everything was in place. The signal flashed again, faint but stubborn. "Unlikely," he muttered. "But not impossible." Raymond still hadn't moved. His eyes were on Max, who hadn't lifted his paw, hadn't blinked. The dog's amber gaze burned with something beyond instinct. A quiet certainty that seemed to say, "Keep watching." The line on the monitor rose once more, steady now, alive. Afterward, Dr. Hayes ordered more tests. Weeks passed in sterile rooms that smelled of cold metal and coffee gone stale. Every few days, Raymond returned, Max trotting at his side. Each time the electrodes were attached, each time the paw touched the leg, the monitor came alive again. Sparks beneath ash, flickers of life returning through channels science had declared dead. Some of the younger doctors whispered words like anomaly, spontaneous partial reconnection, psychosomatic influence. None of them satisfied Hayes. He wanted facts, but facts refused him. For Raymond, facts no longer mattered. He could feel again. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough to remember what it meant to exist inside his own skin. The sensation was small, the way fire first feels when you've been numb too long, unbearable in its beauty, unbearable in its truth. The work began then. Therapy sessions, parallel bars, hours of muscle resistance that left him drenched and shaking. Pain came like an old enemy, dragging its familiar weight across his body. And anger followed, as it always did, that bitter companion that whispered, "You'll never make it back." Every time he fell, every time the leg betrayed him, the hopelessness clawed up from the place he'd buried it. Max was there through all of it. In the clinic, lying beneath the bench, his eyes followed every strained movement. When Raymond cursed and threw the crutch aside, Max only tilted his head, unflinching. When Raymond pushed himself too far and collapsed, Max was the first to move, not to comfort, but to stand beside him, steady as a post driven into the ground. Dr. Hayes watched their sessions from behind glass, his expression unreadable. One afternoon, he approached Hank in the hallway. "That animal's not a service dog, is he?" Hank smiled, weary but proud. "Not officially, but he serves better than most." The doctor looked back through the window. Raymond was struggling to take another step, hands trembling on the rail, Max pacing in perfect rhythm beside him. "It's remarkable," Hayes admitted, "but it's also dangerous. Emotional dependence can stall recovery." Hank's answer came low, almost gentle. "Sometimes, Doc, it's the only thing that makes recovery possible." Outside the therapy rooms, spring came slow. Snow melted into rivers that hummed beneath bridges. But inside Raymond's world, progress still measured itself in inches. Each twitch, each spark, each step was both victory and torment. The nerves were waking, and with them, all the pain they'd carried. Late at night, when the clinic lights went dark and the corridors echoed with their own emptiness, Raymond lay awake listening to Max breathe. Sometimes he'd dream of the desert again. The heat, the explosion, the moment a fellow soldier had refused to leave him behind. The memory blurred with the present, Max's weight pressing against him, the same unspoken vow. But healing, even miracle healing, never comes gently. The next fall was harder. A wrong movement, a crack of pain, a sharp reminder of limits. Raymond's fury came fast, raw, and wild. He swung the crutch up, shouted at himself, at the world, at the animal that wouldn't stop looking at him with patience he didn't deserve. "Stop it!" The words tore from him like shrapnel. The crutch flew across the room, clattering near the door. Max didn't flinch. He didn't move at all. For a moment, Raymond thought the dog hadn't understood. But then Max lowered himself slowly, folding his legs beneath his chest, and lay down by the doorway. He turned his head once, meeting Raymond's eyes, no anger, no fear, only quiet resignation, then looked away. Hours passed. The food bowl sat untouched. The silence returned, heavy in a different way now, not peaceful, but hollow. Raymond turned his chair toward the window, unable to look at the dog. Outside, the street lamps flickered against the falling snow. The world caught again between dark and light. Behind him, Max stayed still, breathing, waiting, refusing, once again, to leave. The first night was silent. The kind of silence that didn't heal. The kind that grew teeth. Raymond sat by the window, the glow of the clinic's parking lot lamps washing his face in pale amber light. The food bowl lay untouched on the floor, its metal rim catching a dull reflection from the heater's coil. Max hadn't moved since sunset. He lay pressed against the door, chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate rhythm, eyes open but distant. In the shadows, Raymond could see the faint trace of red on the tiles, scratches where the dog had clawed, desperate to be let out, to escape the weight between them. By morning, the smell of disinfectant and cold coffee had grown unbearable. Hank knocked once, then again, before quietly opening the door. His face was drawn, his hands trembling from age and helplessness. "You can't let him go on like that," he murmured. Raymond didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the German shepherd, whose once proud coat now clung in dull patches. The animal's paws were raw, pads split open from hours of scratching, and yet he hadn't made a sound. He was waiting, not for food, not for forgiveness, but for something deeper. For 3 days, it went on. Max refused every meal, every coaxing word. He only lifted his head when the door creaked or when Raymond's chair rolled closer, as though expecting to be sent away again. His ribs showed faintly under the fur. His breath grew slower, heavier. The nurses whispered outside, worried about the animal, worried about the veteran, but no one dared to intervene. There was something sacred, untouchable, in the quiet despair of that room. On the 3rd night, Raymond couldn't take it anymore. The guilt had turned to acid, burning in the chest, eating through the armor of self-pity he'd built. He rolled the wheelchair closer until its front wheels touched the dog's flank. "Max," he said, barely more than a breath. The name cracked in his throat like a confession. The dog didn't move. His eyes stayed half shut, as if listening from somewhere far beyond reach. Raymond reached down, and for the first time since the war, his hands trembled not from pain, but from shame. The fur beneath his palm was coarse and damp, tangled with dried blood. "I don't deserve you," he whispered, the words catching on something raw. His voice broke, and so did the silence. Max stirred. Slowly he lifted his head and turned it toward the sound. His muzzle brushed against Raymond's arm first, then found the space between his chest and shoulder. He pressed there, firm, unyielding, until Raymond stopped shaking. The veteran's breath hitched, caught between a sob and a laugh, the kind that comes when grief finally meets forgiveness. They stayed that way for a long while. The man folded forward, forehead resting on the dog's neck, the heartbeat beneath fur steady as a drum calling him home. Outside, dawn crept in unnoticed. Light slid across the floor, touching the broken bowls, the chair, the trembling pair. When Hank came by at sunrise, he stopped at the doorway and didn't speak. He simply nodded once, his eyes wet but smiling. The air had changed, not louder, not brighter, but alive again. That morning, Raymond made a choice. No grand speeches, no declarations, just movement. The sound of metal wheels rolling back across tile echoed through the hall. He locked the brakes, leaned forward, and placed both hands on the armrests. Max stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. The dog's stance was steady, front paws planted wide, tail low. Raymond inhaled. The air hurt going in. His arms strained as he lifted, weight trembling through what was left of his strength. The left leg hesitated, uncertain, ghost-like. Max shifted slightly, enough to take part of the burden, not by pulling or pushing, but simply by being there. The wheelchair creaked as Raymond rose, inch by inch, his breath sharp, his jaw clenched. Then, a sound, the quiet scuff of a boot meeting tile. One step. He nearly laughed, except the sound caught behind his teeth. Another breath, another tremor. He took a second step. The body remembered something it thought it had forgotten. Pain screamed up his spine, but beneath it there was something else. Life. He could feel it. Every nerve, every scar, every ounce of failure, all firing at once. He faltered. The room tilted. The old fear came back. The fall, the dust, the heat of the desert. His knees buckled, and for a heartbeat, it was all slipping again. Until Max leaned closer, pressing his shoulder beneath Raymond's hand, anchoring him to the now. No words, no commands. Just presence. Raymond gasped, clutching at the fur, the warmth, the weight that refused to let him hit the ground. He stayed upright, shaking, sweating, barely breathing, but standing. For the first time in 2 years, he didn't fall. Hank watched from the corner, one hand over his mouth, the other gripping his hat like a prayer. Outside the window, the morning light spilled wider, touching the snow-melted street where winter finally gave way to spring. The monitor in the corner of the room blinked faintly, the pulse steady, the line alive. Raymond exhaled, a sound halfway between surrender and relief. Max turned his head upward, amber eyes calm, unblinking. The veteran smiled then, small and tired but real, a smile that said we made it this far. And beneath that light, man and dog stood still. Not heroes, not miracles, just two survivors holding each other up against the weight of the world. The days drifted softly into weeks. The snow outside the cabin had melted into veins of silver water, running through the dirt like small living roads. The pine air smelled of thaw and earth. For the first time in 2 years, Raymond Cole could feel the world beneath him. His legs still trembled with every step, but they obeyed. The cane creaked. Max's steady gait matched his own, and each morning they ventured a little farther into the clearing, two silhouettes moving as one against the sunlit valley. Hank would watch from the porch, a mug of coffee steaming in his old hands, the quiet pride in his eyes saying what words never could. It almost felt like peace had come to stay. The kind of peace that arrives after too many battles, fragile but real. Then one morning, the hum of an engine rose from the base of the hill. Hank squinted into the distance as a truck climbed the dirt road, its tires grinding over thawed gravel. When it stopped, a man stepped out, mid-50s, square-jawed, shoulders broad beneath a faded K-9 division jacket. His gray hair was cropped short, his eyes sharp but tired, the kind of tired only soldiers wore. The name stitched above his chest read, Calloway. He moved with quiet purpose, every step measured, like someone still obeying orders out of habit. "I heard about a dog," he said to Hank, offering a hand that felt more like a salute. "One that shouldn't be alive." Raymond appeared behind the screen door, cane in hand, Max beside him, ears pricked. When Calloway's gaze met the dog's, something shifted in his face. Surprise, then disbelief. He took a step forward, eyes softening. "That's him," he murmured. "That's the one they called a failure." Raymond frowned. "Failure?" he repeated, his voice quiet but cutting. Calloway nodded, crouching down to run his fingers behind Max's ear, where a faded scar hid beneath the fur. "He wouldn't attack," the man said. "Wouldn't chase. Every time his handler went down, he stayed beside him. They said he disobeyed, too gentle, too still. He failed every test that mattered to men, but not the one that mattered to hearts." The room felt smaller. Raymond's chest tightened, his throat dry. His mind flashed back to the night Max pressed his head against a lifeless leg, The days of silence, the refusal to eat, the refusal to leave. He wasn't broken, Raymond thought. He was just waiting for someone worth standing beside. Hank leaned against the porch rail, his voice low and tremulous. So they threw him away because he cared too much? Calloway's smile was heavy. Some men want warriors. They forget that guardians look the same, until it's too late. He straightened, meeting Raymond's gaze. You're lucky, son. That dog's not a failure. He's a survivor, like you. Raymond didn't answer. He knelt down instead, ignoring the strain in his knees, and touched Max's chest. Beneath his palm, the heartbeat was strong and calm, steady as truth itself. In that rhythm, he felt everything align. The nights of despair, the dawns of effort, the silent companionship that had never asked for praise. Later that afternoon, Raymond sat by the window, watching light spill through the trees. The world felt newly drawn, sharper, almost tender. Every memory of Max, his stillness, his eyes that seemed to understand, now made sense. The dog hadn't failed at obedience. He'd simply refused to abandon those who'd fallen. He wasn't trained to fight, Raymond realized. He was born to protect. That night, the peace shattered. A storm gathered without warning, the kind that came roaring down from the Rockies like an old god remembering its power. The wind bent the trees, rain came in sheets, and thunder rolled across the valley in waves. Hank was out by the truck, securing the tools under a tarp, cursing the storm's timing. Max paced near the door, uneasy, ears flattening against his skull. Raymond called out for his father, but the answer was swallowed by wind. Then came the sound, a crack so violent it silenced everything. The world flashed white and then a crash. Metal shrieking, wood splitting, a deep groan that echoed through the forest. The lights flickered and died. Raymond lunged toward the window and froze. The pine outside, the oldest on the property, had fallen. Its massive trunk crushed Hank's truck, branches jutting like spears. Through the swirl of rain, a faint shape moved beneath it. "Dad!" He didn't remember reaching the door. Only the cold, sharp as glass, biting into his lungs. The wind ripped at him, rain needled his face. Max was already ahead, a streak of white and brown cutting through the storm. Raymond stumbled, nearly falling, but the dog circled back, pressing against his leg, guiding him forward through mud and debris. They reached the wreck. Hank lay half-pinned beneath the branch, his face pale, breath shallow. "Dad, don't move!" Raymond shouted, his own voice nearly lost in the roar. He knelt, hands trembling. The pain in his back screamed, but he ignored it. Max barked once, then again, pacing, then digging at the snow-packed ground, clearing debris with frantic precision. Every motion was urgent but controlled, the kind of focus only born of training and love. Raymond pushed against the branch. It didn't move. He tried again, his arms trembling, teeth gritted, breath hitching. Lightning carved the sky above them, every flash revealing the scene like a photograph. The wrecked truck, the old man gasping, the soldier fighting ghosts of his own weakness. "Come on," he growled, voice breaking. "Not like this." The branch shifted an inch. Max wedged his shoulder underneath, straining with a low growl. Raymond felt something snap in his back, but he kept pushing. Inch by inch, the weight gave way. Hank's body slid free. Raymond fell backward into the snow, dragging his father into his lap. "Dad, stay with me," he gasped. Hank coughed, sputtering, eyes fluttering open. "Still, Bossy as ever, the old man rasped. Raymond almost laughed. Max pressed close, licking Hank's hand, whining low. The sirens, faint, distant, began to echo through the valley. That was when Raymond noticed. His hands were steady, his arms burned, his legs throbbed, but they were holding him. He wasn't kneeling anymore. He was standing. The wind howled through the trees, the storm raging around them, but he stood firm, his body trembling under the weight of exhaustion and grace. Max leaned against him, not to carry him this time, but to remind him he could stand alone. Raymond looked down at the dog, rain streaming from his coat, those amber eyes locked on him with something ancient and certain. Hank opened his eyes again, blinking against the rain. "Son," he whispered, voice cracking, "you're on your feet." Raymond laughed through his tears, shaking his head. "No, Dad," he said softly, his hand resting on Max's back. "We're all on our feet." The sirens grew louder, closer, flashing red against the wet pines. In that storm-lit clearing, 3 lives, 1 broken truck, 1 steadfast dog, the world found a heartbeat again. The pain was still there. The scars, the losses, the memories, all of it. But beneath it ran something deeper. Faith, quiet and enduring, like the rhythm of pause in the snow. And as the rescuers approached, Raymond whispered into the rain, not to anyone in particular, but to the God who had hidden himself in a dog's heart. "Thank you for sending him." The storm left the valley scarred and shining. Branches littered the ground like the bones of winter, and the air held that sharp, clean scent of things reborn. For a long time, Raymond lay in the hospital bed, not from injury, but from exhaustion, the kind that lives deep in the soul. When he finally returned home, spring had come to the Rockies, slow and deliberate, like a promise being carefully kept. The snow that once buried the cabin had melted into small rivulets, trickling past stones and roots, whispering stories of survival. Hank met him at the porch, leaning heavier on his own cane now, a bandage still wrapped around his forearm. He said nothing, just placed a hand on his son's shoulder and nodded toward the trail. Raymond smiled faintly, bracing himself against the wood railing, the sun glinting off the metal braces strapped to his legs. He still used a cane, but not the chair. The wheels that once defined his days now rested in the shed, gathering dust beside forgotten tools. Max came trotting from the yard, fur gleaming gold under the weak sunlight, tail low and steady. His gait was careful, matching Raymond's rhythm as though he'd memorized every uncertain step. When Raymond paused, Max paused. When he exhaled, Max exhaled too, a quiet mirror of the man's breath. 2 hearts finding the same pace. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full, alive with understanding. Life at the cabin changed in small ways that felt enormous. Mornings began with Hank's coffee brewing, the smell seeping through the old pine boards, mingling with damp earth. The radio played softly, old country songs crackling through static. Sometimes Raymond joined in humming, his voice gravelly, unpracticed, but real. And always, Max was there, lying by the fire, head resting on his paws, watching everything with that calm, patient gaze. Neighbors started coming by again, first to see the wreck, then to see the miracle. They brought pies, handshakes, and questions. Raymond answered with a modest smile and said little. The story had already grown beyond him. They called Max the guardian dog, the one who wouldn't give up. But for Raymond, it wasn't about heroism. It was about faith, the quiet kind that doesn't need witnesses. Weeks passed. The valley thawed. Rivers broke free of ice, and green began to show between rocks. One morning, Raymond stood outside the cabin with Max and Hank, the sun climbing over the ridge. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, but gentle enough to promise warmth. The three of them began the slow climb up the trail behind the house, the same path Raymond had once watched from his window, believing he'd never walk it again. Each step was a memory. The battlefield, the hospital, the silence of the cabin, the touch of a dog's paw against a dead leg. The world has shifted since then, but not all at once. Healing, he'd learned, was not a single moment of triumph. It was 1,000 small surrenders stitched together by love. Halfway up the ridge, Hank stopped to catch his breath. "Never thought I'd see this day," he murmured. Raymond looked at him, smiling. "Neither did I." Max barked once, as if seconding the thought, tail thumping against the dirt. By the time they reached the top, the valley stretched wide beneath them, rivers glinting like glass, meadows still dotted with snow. The cabin looked small from up there, almost like a memory fading into peace. Raymond stood still, letting the wind rush past him, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow. The sunlight caught the metal braces around his legs, turning them into something almost beautiful. Not symbols of weakness, but of endurance. Hank rested a hand on his son's back. "You made it," he said simply. Raymond didn't answer. He was looking at Max, who stood beside him with ears perked, eyes calm, tail swaying gently. The dog's fur rippled in the breeze, catching light like fire beneath the sun. Raymond knelt slowly, the movement awkward but determined. The ground was cold and damp beneath his knees. Max tilted his head, watching, then stepped forward until his muzzle brushed against Raymond's chest, the same place he had pressed 2 winters ago, when everything seemed lost. Raymond's hand found the dog's neck, his voice quiet and steady. "You didn't fail me," he whispered. "You just waited until I was ready." Max blinked, then leaned closer, eyes half closing in that familiar peace. Hank turned away, pretending to wipe dust from his eye. For a long moment, none of them moved. The wind shifted again, carrying the sounds of the valley, melting streams, distant birds, the hush of pine needles. Life itself seemed to pause, holding its breath for the 3 souls standing there. The old man who had kept faith, the soldier who had regained it, and the dog who had never lost it. Then Raymond straightened, his knees held, his body swayed, then found balance. Max stepped back, giving him space, not to support him, but to walk beside him, equal now in strength and purpose. They began their descent as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. Raymond moved slowly but steadily, the cane tapping against the stones, Max trotting close enough that their shadows blended into one. Behind them, Hank followed at his own pace, humming softly under his breath, the same tune that had once filled the cabin during the long winter nights. At the foot of the ridge, Raymond stopped and turned back. The ridge stood tall behind them, the last snow glimmering in the fading light. He smiled faintly, a smile touched with gratitude and awe. He didn't see the scars anymore, not on the land, not on himself. Only the proof that mercy could grow in the unlikeliest soil. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, waiting. Max bounded up the steps first, shaking the dust from his coat before settling by the hearth. Hank hung his hat on the wall and sat heavily in his chair, exhaling a long, contented sigh. Raymond paused at the doorway, hand resting on the frame. The house smelled like coffee and wood smoke and life, the kind of life built on second chances. He turned toward Max, who lifted his head and met his gaze. For a brief, wordless instant, they shared everything: the nights of pain, the mornings of hope, the bond forged through suffering and silence. Raymond smiled. "Come on, partner," he said softly. "We've got some living to do." Outside, the wind carried away the last of the snow, scattering it into the valley below. The cabin lights flickered warm against the gathering dusk. And in that quiet corner of the Rockies, under a sky washed clean by storm and mercy alike, a man who once believed he'd never stand again took his first steps into the rest of his life. Not back to what was lost, but forward into what was left. Life, loyalty, and the quiet grace of a second chance. A wounded soldier and a loyal dog taught each other how to live again. Their courage wasn't loud, but it reached farther than any shout could. Because real loyalty isn't about orders or duty. It's about staying when the world walks away, about the hearts that keep beating beside us when everything else falls silent. Some fights happen on battlefields, others in quiet cabins where faith is rebuilt one breath at a time. And sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change everything. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, patient, faithful, carrying its strength in fur, in scars, or in silence. And that silence, it's where mercy begins. So if this story touched something in you, stay a while. Subscribe and keep walking with us through the quiet roads where loyalty still lives. Because somewhere out there, in another valley, another small miracle is waiting to be found.